before there were space marines, before there were Primarchs scattered across the cold dark between the stars, before there was a great crusade with its golden banners and its millions of soldiers and its dream of humanity reclaiming everything it had ever lost, before any of that existed, even as an idea spoken out loud, there was a single man standing at the Emperor's shoulder, watching, waiting, ready to kill. His name was Constantine Valdor, and his story is one of the most quietly devastating, most persistently mysterious, and most deeply human things in all of Warhammer 40,000. He doesn't carry the thunderous mythology of a Primarch. He didn't fall to chaos or burn a world or shatter a legion in a single legendary moment. He didn't charge headlong into history with the kind of furious, world-shaking drama that the sons of the Emperor seem to attract the way stars attract gravity. Valdor was something else entirely. He was the still point at the center of a storm that lasted 10,000 years. He was the blade that never missed, the shield that never buckled, the sentinel who never once asked whether the work was worth the cost. And then, one night, without a word to anyone who had a right to know, he walked out of the Imperial Palace and was never seen again. Nobody knows where he went. Not the Custodian Guard he spent centuries building into the finest individual warriors in the history of humanity. Not the greatest strategists in the Imperium. Not the scholars who have spent millennia trying to piece together a coherent account of the Horus Heresy and its aftermath. Not even the institution he created, the 10,000, who still stand their eternal vigil at the gates of the Emperor's palace, knows what happened to their first Captain General after the night he whispered 2 words into the dark and vanished. His fate is one of the most tantalizing open questions in the entire setting. And if certain fragments of lore from the 41st millennium are to be believed, the answer to that question may be the most important thing that happens to the Imperium of Man in 10,000 years. This is the story of the first Custodian. Every piece of it I'm going to tell you tonight is rooted in the established lore. Where I'm stepping into speculation or fan theory, I'll tell you, because that's important. But the facts alone are extraordinary enough that they don't need embellishment. They just need space to breathe. So settle in. This one runs deep. Section 1. The origin of an idea before there were custodians. To understand Constantine Valdor, you have to understand the world he was born into, because that world is so far removed from anything we might recognize as civilization that it requires a moment to let it properly land. Old Earth, in the centuries before the Unification Wars began, was not the thrumming administrative heart of a galactic empire. It was not even a particularly functional planet. The Age of Strife had torn human civilization across the stars into isolated fragments, cutting off the colony worlds from one another and from their origin point, and the resulting centuries of isolation, warfare, mutation, and desperation had turned Terra into something that the word dystopia doesn't quite do justice to. Entire continents had been reduced to nuclear wastelands. Ancient coastlines had shifted as sea levels changed, and pollution killed the oceans in degrees. The cities that remained were often more like fortified citadels than living communities, places where people survived within walls rather than thrived in the open, because the open was controlled by whoever had the biggest weapons and the least patience. The continent of what had been Europe was dominated by competing techno-barbarian states of varying degrees of depravity. To the south, in the regions that had once been the breadbasket civilizations of the ancient world, warlords held populations hostage with genetic experimentation that had been running long enough that some of the things it produced were barely human anymore. To the north, in the frozen wastes of what had once been Scandinavia, a confederacy called Malland Sen practiced the kind of ritual human sacrifice and forbidden biological manipulation that sounds like something from a horror story, until you realize that in this world, it was Tuesday. The Pan-Pacific Empire held vast swaths of the East under a tyrant named Narthan Doom, who had elevated cruelty into something that almost resembled ideology. Ursh, in the Central Steppes, commanded an army of psychers whose dark abilities they pointed at anyone who looked at them wrong. This was the world. This was what humanity had become, at the center of its own civilization, in the absence of the thing that might have guided it better. The Emperor had been present throughout all of this. He had walked through human history in forms that the lore deliberately obscures: shepherd, teacher, warrior, sometimes a king, sometimes a wanderer, always a being who was already of a different category from the people around him. He had been alive, in one form or another, for tens of thousands of years before the Unification Wars began. He had accumulated knowledge and power, and an understanding of the warp and its dangers that made him the single most formidable being in the human portion of the galaxy. He had watched human civilization rise and fall, and rise and fall, and he had a plan for what came next, that he had been developing for longer than most civilizations had existed. The key insight behind that plan was this: humanity was running out of time. The warp was becoming increasingly unstable. The Chaos Gods were growing stronger as human psychic development accelerated. If something didn't fundamentally change, if humanity didn't unify and expand and develop the kind of collective power and identity that could stand against what was coming from the immaterial universe, the species was going to be consumed. Not over thousands of years, but potentially within centuries. The darkness that the Emperor could feel building in the immaterial realm wasn't a distant threat. It was an arriving one. And so, he began. He began with warriors, because you cannot unify a fractured world with philosophy alone. The techno-barbarian states of Terra didn't respond to arguments. They responded to force. So the Emperor built force, first and most immediately in the form of the Thunder Warriors, enormous, genetically modified soldiers who were the closest thing to the Space Marines that the technology and knowledge of the time could produce. They were devastating. They were terrifying. They tore through the armies of the warlords like something from a nightmare, and the warlords, one by one, began to understand that there was a new power on Terra, and it was not interested in negotiating from a position of weakness. But the Thunder Warriors were tools for a specific moment, and the Emperor knew it even as he built them. Their modifications were too aggressive, too imprecise, too driven by the need for immediate capability rather than long-term stability. They were burning through their own biology. Their minds were becoming unpredictable. They were, in the most necessary and the most painful sense, expendable, built to serve until they were no longer needed, and then to be replaced by something better. What he needed alongside the Thunder Warriors was something entirely different. Not soldiers for the campaign of unification, something more specific, more personal, more deliberately and carefully made, something that would last. He needed guardians, not an army, something rarer than an army. A small number of individuals, each one remade from the ground up by the most sophisticated genetic and biological technology he could deploy. Each one a unique creation that couldn't be mass-produced because its quality specifically required that it not be mass-produced. Each one, when finished, would be genuinely distinct from every other person in the world and from every other guardian in the group, because the bespoke nature of the process was what gave them their extraordinary capability. He would call them the Legio Custodes, the Custodian Guard, and the first one he made, or the first one he made successfully. The lore maintains a careful ambiguity on this point, was Constantine Valdor. Before Valdor was Valdor, he was a child. A specific child that the Emperor identified through means the lore doesn't fully explain, except to note that they were extreme. According to the scientist Amara Starde, whose work on genetic modification laid the groundwork for the Space Marine project itself, the Emperor had Valdor's biological parents killed and then moved entire armies across continents to retrieve the boy. The scale of that effort, entire armies, across continents, for a single child, says something about what the Emperor saw in him. Whatever it was worth an enormous amount of logistical and political capital at a moment when both were in very short supply. Valdor himself, when later sources ask him about his origins, has essentially nothing to offer. He doesn't remember his parents. He doesn't remember the life he had before the Emperor's process remade him. Whether this is because the process was so comprehensive that it effectively ended the person who existed before and created a new one, or because the Emperor deliberately excised those memories as part of the transformation, or simply because enough time has passed that whatever fragments remained have faded, isn't specified. He notes, with a characteristic absence of visible distress about it, that he doesn't know if he was truly the first custodian or simply the first successful one. There may have been people before him who went through some version of the process and didn't survive it, or who came out the other end as something other than what the Emperor intended. This uncertainty, and the equanimity with which Valdor holds it, is one of the defining things about him. Most people, confronted with the knowledge that they have no memory of their childhood, no knowledge of their parents, no continuity with whoever they were, before a transformation so complete that it essentially constituted a second creation, most people would find that destabilizing, if not actively devastating. Valdor holds it the way he holds everything else, with a stillness that is not emptiness, but something more like a very deep pool, the surface undisturbed because the current underneath knows exactly where it's going and doesn't need to announce itself. The Emperor looked at this child and saw something worth moving armies for. And then he built that something into being. Section 2. The making of Constantine Valdor, the first and the finest. The process of creating a custodian is one of the most deliberately obscured things in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Games Workshop has kept the specifics intentionally mysterious, and the in-universe sources, the few that exist, are consistently vague about the technical details. Part of this is for narrative reasons. The custodians work better as phenomena than as mechanisms, and explaining too precisely how they were built would diminish the sense of them as something genuinely beyond ordinary understanding. Part of it is that, within the fiction itself, the knowledge required to create custodians was apparently so personal to the Emperor that it has not survived in any replicable form. The Adeptus Mechanicus can maintain custodian equipment. They can repair custodian armor. They cannot create new custodians from scratch because the process required the Emperor's direct involvement, and the Emperor is no longer in a position to provide it. What we do know, from the various lore sources that have addressed it, is this. The process begins with a human being. Unlike Space Marines, who are most commonly recruited from adolescents of appropriate genetic stock, custodians have historically been drawn from specific individuals often, the lore suggests. The sons of the noble houses of Terra, selected by the Emperor's own assessment of their potential. This is not class privilege in the ordinary sense. The noble houses of Terra, even in the age of the Unification Wars, were not simply wealthy families with connections. They were, in many cases, lineages that had been carefully maintained and recorded over generations, whose genetic heritage had been tracked and in some cases deliberately cultivated. The Emperor could look at a genetic profile and see what it might become under the right conditions. Most profiles led to nothing remarkable. A very few he chose. Once chosen, the subject underwent a process that was not a series of surgical implants in the way that Space Marine creation is, but something far more fundamental. The modifications happened at the level of the genetic code itself, rewriting the body's basic instructions across every cell and tissue and organ system. This wasn't enhancement in the sense of adding things to a working foundation. It was reconstruction, taking apart what existed and rebuilding it according to specifications that, in the Emperor's estimation, represented the absolute ceiling of what human biology could potentially become. Each modification was individually tailored to the specific subject. This is why no two custodians are identical, even in terms of their capabilities, and why the process takes so long the Emperor was working. Each time, from first principles, mapping the specific terrain of a specific person's biology and optimizing every variable. The result was a being who operated at a level above Space Marines, in the same way that Space Marines operate above ordinary soldiers. A custodian's raw physical statistics, strength, speed, endurance, the ability to absorb damage and continue functioning exceed those of even the finest Astartes. But the more significant difference isn't physical, it's cognitive. Custodians were not built to follow orders efficiently. They were built to exercise judgment independently. A Space Marine is a superlative soldier who operates best within a structure, a chapter, a company, a squad, a defined mission with clear objectives. A custodian is something closer to a living policy, able to assess a situation that has never been anticipated, decide what the Emperor would want done, and execute that decision without supervision or confirmation. Each custodian carries in their mind not just tactical training, but a comprehensive model of the Emperor's intentions and values, so detailed and so precisely maintained that they can reliably predict what he would authorize, even in circumstances he has never been asked about. This is what extensions of the Emperor's will means in practical terms. Not that they do whatever they're told, that they know, without being told, what needs to be done. For Valdor, the first of them, the degree to which this model was accurate was extraordinary. He had spent more time in direct personal contact with the Emperor than any other custodian, participating in conversations that shaped the Imperium before it had a name, developing an understanding of the Master of Mankind's actual intentions that went far deeper than what was recorded in any document or any formal statement of imperial policy. He knew what the Emperor wanted, because he had been present while the Emperor was deciding what he wanted. He had watched the thinking happen in real time. The Apollonian spear, the weapon the Emperor placed in Valdor's hands when he took on the role of Captain General, was an artifact that existed at the same level of sophistication as its wielder. The Emperor made it himself, not commissioned, not designed, and handed off actually made, by the same hands that were simultaneously trying to unify a planet and plan the reclamation of a galaxy. In form, it was a Guardian spear, the standard weapon of the Custodian Guard, combining a power blade of devastating sharpness with an integrated bolter, capable of firing rounds that would punch through power armor at ranges that put its wielder well out of most melee threats. But in Valdor's hands, both the melee and ranged components operated at a level of precision and lethality that the standard versions of those same weapons simply couldn't match. And then there was the other property, the one that isn't about physical damage at all. When Valdor killed someone with the Apollonian spear, the spear told him something about them. Precisely what mechanism produced this effect, whether psychic, technological, or something in the ambiguous space between the two that the highest levels of the Imperium's science regularly occupy, the lore hasn't specified. But the effect is described consistently. The spear allowed its wielder to absorb the memories and experiences of those who fell to it, or alternatively, to perceive some truth about the nature of the being it killed. The true self, stripped of its pretensions and its armor and its carefully maintained fictions, in a universe where daemons are real and chaos is a physical force, and the nature of things often bears no relationship to how those things present themselves. This property is not merely interesting. It is potentially world-changing. Every enemy that the Apollonian spear's blade has touched has contributed something to the library of understanding that Valdor carries inside him. Every daemon he killed during the siege of Terra, every psyker who fell to him on Prospero, every traitor and corrupt official and chaos-touched monster he has encountered across what is now an extremely long life. And one more, someone he killed near the end of the siege of Terra, when he struck the first captain of the Sons of Horus with that blade and saw, in that moment of contact, the next 10,000 years laid out before him. But we'll get to that. Understanding the Apollonian spear is important because it goes a long way toward explaining what Valdor might have become over 10 millennia of operating in secret. He wasn't just accumulating experience in the ordinary way, the way any very old, very capable person accumulates experience. He was, through every kill that Spear made, absorbing information about the universe that no one else could access in the same way. By the 41st millennium, if he's still alive, Valdor may understand the warp and the nature of chaos, and the true character of the entities that serve it, better than almost any other material being has ever understood anything. That knowledge is what makes everything that follows worth paying attention to. Section 3. The Unification Wars. Blood and Gold on Old Earth. Old Terra, during the Unification Wars, was a planet at war with itself in almost every direction, simultaneously. The Emperor's forces moved from campaign to campaign across decades, sometimes centuries. Depending on how you date the start of the unification project, and the opposition ranged from simple military powers to states that had trafficked deeply enough with dark forces that the borders between political and supernatural threat had become genuinely blurry. The Battle of Malin Sen is the earliest confirmed appearance of Constantine Valdor in the historical record, and it is also one of the most revealing moments of the early unification wars in terms of what they actually cost. Malin Sen was a confederacy that occupied the northern reaches of the European continent, the lands that had once been Scandinavia, now frozen and bitter, and ruled by a figure called the Priest King, This was not simply a political or military enemy of the Emperor's unification project. The Malin-Sen Confederacy was, knowingly or not, and the evidence suggests, mostly the latter, in the service of the Chaos Gods. Their religious practice centered on cannibalistic human sacrifice. Their military capability was built around genetic modification that had been applied to their soldiers in ways that produced results, which were effective but horrifying, twisting human flesh into configurations that the early Imperium scholars would later recognize as early manifestations of the corruption that the ruinous powers spread through populations they work on over time. The priest king himself was a genuine believer. He thought the things he was doing were holy. He thought the sacrifices were necessary, that the suffering was devotion, that the voices he heard in the dark were divine. The Chaos Gods are very good at making people believe this. It's one of their most reliable tools. The Emperor attacked Malin-Sen early and deliberately, before moving on to some of the other confederacies that might have been easier targets. The reasons were both strategic and something beyond strategy. Malin-Sen represented precisely the kind of civilizational darkness that the Emperor's project was designed to eradicate at its roots. Not just defeat militarily, but demonstrate, clearly and completely, that it had no future. The battle was a bloodbath. The Emperor's forces, the Custodians, alongside the Thunder Warriors, supported by various other elements of the still-forming Imperial military, were outnumbered by 7-1. The forces they faced were not ordinary soldiers. The genetically modified warriors of Malin-Sen were powerful and nearly fearless, the psychically empowered soldiers among them, capable of warping the immediate environment around a battle in ways that made traditional tactical planning unreliable. The zealots who filled out their ranks had the particular terrifying quality of people who genuinely did not care whether they survived, which makes them far more dangerous in close-quarters combat than soldiers who are fighting to live. 7,000 Thunder Warriors died in this campaign. 7,000. The Thunder Warriors were not easy to kill. They were enormous, they were fast, they were biologically enhanced to an extreme that made them individually dangerous opponents for almost anything human armies of the era could field. Losing 7,000 of them is a number that should stop you in your tracks, because it gives you a sense of the actual scale of what the unification wars cost in the people they consumed. Through all of it, the first Custodian fought, not from a command position removed from the action, not directing the battle at a careful distance. Valdor was in the fighting, and witnesses who survived to give accounts of the campaign described what they saw in terms that kept circling back to the same quality, the sense that he was operating in a different version of the battle from everyone around him. Where other warriors moved from threat to threat, reacting, improvising, doing their best to survive a situation that was trying very hard to kill them, Valdor seemed to be moving through a version of the battle that was already decided. Every step was exactly the right step. Every strike was placed with an economy that made even the Thunder Warriors, who were themselves formidable martial specimens, look like they were working harder than necessary. The Apollonian spear moved through enemies, and the enemies fell, and Valdor moved to the next one, and the next, and the battle progressed around him the way weather progresses around a mountain. The storm was real, the storm was terrible, but the mountain was simply there, doing what mountains do, which is to say not moving. The Priest King was captured after the battle's climactic conclusion, which the records call the Battle of the Red Frost, a name that tells you something about the conditions and something about what the ground looked like afterward. His execution was carried out either by the Emperor himself or by a Custodian, depending on which account you trust. Either way, the head was separated from the body, and the body of what it had represented was separated from the future of Terra, and Malin-Sen fell. But it was what Valdor observed during the fighting, not what he did, that would echo through the rest of his life, and through the decisions he made in the years that followed. The Thunder Warriors, at the height of the battle, went feral. This is the word the sources consistently use, or something close to it. Not just aggressive, not just effective, not just fierce feral. They lost themselves in the killing. They stopped being soldiers and became something closer to a natural disaster, something that moved through the battlefield, consuming everything in reach, because consuming things in reach was the only thing their biology was capable of expressing in that moment. Their general Yushotan was a formidable commander who could sometimes channel and direct this quality, but at Malin-Sen, under sufficient pressure and sufficient stimulus, the Thunder Warriors' control broke down, and what replaced it was a state of pure, directionless violence. Valdor saw this. He watched it happen from the eye of the battle's most intense moments, because the eye of the battle's most intense moments was, for him, a slightly calmer place than it was for everyone else. And he formed a judgment that the lore doesn't record explicitly, but that everything he did afterward makes evident. The Thunder Warriors were magnificent. Yushotan was someone he genuinely admired, a commander of real skill and personal courage, dark-humored and complex in ways that made him more interesting than most people Valdor encountered, and possessed of the kind of ferocious loyalty that, when directed toward the right things, was something close to beautiful. But they were not a foundation you could build an Imperium on. They were weapons that could turn in the hand, and a weapon that might turn was, eventually, more dangerous than anything it had been made to fight. He said none of this to the Emperor. Valdor didn't offer unsolicited strategic counsel, even to the Master of Mankind. He formed his assessment, he stored it, and he waited to see if events would make it relevant. They did, sooner than even he probably expected. Several years after Malin Sen, Valdor performed an action that tells you as much about his character as almost anything else in his documented history. He traveled to the Anwatan Steppes, a region that had come under imperial influence, but whose ruling class still needed to be managed, with a careful hand, and he assassinated a woman named Koja Zu, who served as its minister. Then he claimed her son, Ra Endymion, for the Legio Custodes. On the surface level, this is a straightforward piece of Unification Wars politics. Remove an obstacle, acquire a resource. But the specific combination of actions says something more. Valdor killed the mother and took the child. He didn't kill the child. He didn't simply remove both of them as potential complications. He looked at the child and saw something the same quality the Emperor's eyes could perceive in certain people, and he decided that quality was worth more than the political simplicity of a clean slate. Ra Endymion would become, over the following centuries, one of the most significant custodians of the heresy era, a warrior of genuine distinction who would fight in campaigns that shaped the Imperium's survival. His existence is, in one of the many quietly devastating ways that Valdor's story works, a monument to the fact that the first custodian's decisions were not purely tactical. There was something else operating underneath the assessment, something that found it harder to discard potential than most people in his position found comfortable. As the Unification Wars moved toward their conclusion, Valdor's prominence grew alongside the Emperor's expanding reach. By the time the wars were winding down, Valdor had emerged as the third point of what the lore describes as a ruling triumvirate alongside the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite. This was not a formal constitutional arrangement. Terra didn't have anything formal enough to call a constitution yet. It was simply the way power organized itself around the most capable and most trusted people. And those three were, by common assessment, the people around whom everything else organized itself. The end of the Unification Wars brought with it one of the most morally complex moments that Valdor would ever navigate. The conspiracy that history records as the Imperial Palace coup gathered around the Grand Provost Marshal Uwoma Kandawire and several surviving Thunder Warriors under the command of Yushotan. Kandawire was not a stupid person or a purely malicious one. She had genuine concerns about the direction the Emperor's project was taking, about the accumulation of absolute power in a single being with no checks or accountability, about what it meant for humanity to organize itself completely around one man's vision, regardless of how extraordinary that vision might be. The Thunder Warriors who joined her did so partly out of shared concern and partly out of simple, understandable rage at what they were beginning to understand was happening to them, that they were being replaced, that their bodies were failing them, that the Emperor had built them for a purpose, and that purpose was now served, and they were being set aside. Valdor had seen it coming. He had dispatched an agent to investigate Kandawire before the conspirators made their move, which indicates that his intelligence work was sufficiently comprehensive that he'd identified the threat forming. But the warning came too late to prevent the coup itself. When the confrontation arrived, when Kandawire stood before him with Yushotan and the surviving Thunder Warriors at her side, Valdor asked them to surrender. Not as a formality, he genuinely gave them the option. He was capable of ending this, and he knew it, and he preferred not to. Words were better than the Apollonian spear, if words could accomplish the same thing. They refused. Valdor deployed the Proto-Legiones Astartes in their first-ever combat engagement, the early Space Marines. Not yet fully formed, as the Astartes, the heresy era, would know, but already formidable enough to be decisive, and the coup was crushed. He killed Yushotan himself. He took the life of a man he had admired and respected and found more genuinely interesting than almost anyone else he'd met in the wars, because the mission required it, and the mission was everything. He took no satisfaction, and Elo is explicit and specific about this. He didn't feel the grim fulfillment that duty-driven people sometimes find in necessity. He felt something more ambiguous, more uncomfortable. The feeling of a person who has had to do something correct and terrible, and who understands, with perfect clarity, that the correctness doesn't cancel the terribleness. And then, and this is the moment that most reveals Valdor's character in full, he let Kandawire go. She had led a coup against the Emperor. She had allied with forces that, if they had succeeded, might have killed the master of mankind, and ended the entire project that Valdor had given his existence to serving. The logical response, the expedient response, the response that removed the most obvious future complications, was to eliminate her along with the rest of the conspiracy. Valdor told her to leave, to retire, to go somewhere far from the center of things, and live whatever remained of her life in peace. No one fully understands why. The lore doesn't explain it. It simply records that Valdor made this decision, and she went, and that was the end of it. Maybe he recognized in Kandawire someone who had genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Maybe there was a calculation about the political value of mercy in a moment when the Imperium was still new enough that how its founding figure treated his opponents would become part of the story people told about it. Maybe it was simpler and more human than any calculation. Maybe he had killed enough people today, and this one didn't need to die. The unification of Terra was complete. The Thunder Warriors were gone. The Space Marines were coming. The galaxy was waiting to be reclaimed. And the first Custodian stood at the threshold of everything, his golden armor still carrying the residue of a war that had cost more than most people would ever be asked to pay. The next stage was about to begin. Section 4. The Triumvirate of Terra Valdor, Malkador, and the Emperor. If the Custodians were the Emperor's hands, the physical means by which his will was expressed in the world, then Malkador the Sigillite was his administrative mind, and Constantine Valdor was something that doesn't have a clean, functional description. The person who understood him best, who served him most directly, who knew the difference between what he said and what he meant. The relationship between the three members of this triumvirate is one of the most fascinating things in early imperial history, and it's also one of the most obscured. The records of this period are fragmentary, even by 31st millennium standards. The unification wars were fought before anything resembling a comprehensive historical apparatus had been established, and much of what happened in those decades of brutal, all-encompassing warfare was either never written down or was subsequently lost or deliberately removed from the accessible record. What survives comes mostly from sources that are themselves uncertain remembrancers, who worked from accounts that were already second-hand. Historians who were trying to reconstruct events from physical evidence and the unreliable memories of people who had survived things they didn't fully understand. But the broad shape of the triumvirate is clear enough to say something meaningful about. Malkador, the Sigillite, was, by any honest assessment, one of the most extraordinary human beings who has ever lived. He was the Emperor's right hand in the fullest sense. His administrative genius, his political intelligence, his capacity for the kind of long-range institutional thinking that takes a goal and works backward from it to build the structures that will allow it to be achieved. He was also a psyker of staggering power, not quite at the Emperor's level. No one else was at the Emperor's level, but far above anyone else in the human population. And he had been at the Emperor's side long enough, in a relationship deep enough, that the two of them had developed the kind of shorthand that only comes from decades of absolute mutual trust. Valdor was different from Malkador in ways that made them genuinely complementary. Where Malkador thought in institutions, Valdor thought in individuals. Where Malkador built systems that would outlast their architects, Valdor ensured that the immediate moment was survived in the first place. Where Malkador was the visionary administrator who could hold 1,000 moving parts in his mind simultaneously and understand how they fit together, Valdor was the being at the specific point of failure, the person in the room when things were going wrong, able to make the exact right call without needing guidance. Their views on how to serve the Emperor weren't always aligned. The argument over the Officio Assassinorum's mission against Horus, which we'll revisit when we get to the heresy, is an example of how differently they could approach the same problem. But the disagreements were never personal and never allowed to fester. They both understood what the other was for, and they both trusted the Emperor to arbitrate when necessary. The Emperor's own relationship with Valdor was something that the lore treats with careful delicacy. The word friend is probably not right, because the Emperor's relationship to ordinary human categories like friendship was itself complicated in ways the lore deliberately leaves ambiguous. But there was something there that went beyond utility. The sources that get closest to the Emperor's inner life during this period, and they're few, and they're uncertain, consistently show him taking a specific interest in Valdor that exceeded what his organizational needs alone would explain. He talked to him, actually talked to him, in the way that people who are genuinely engaged with each other talk, not just giving instructions and receiving reports, but something more like an exchange between equals, which is remarkable given what the Emperor was. The conversations aren't recorded in detail, but their existence is confirmed, and Valdor's later behavior in various situations suggests he had access to the Emperor's actual reasoning in ways that even other custodians, even Malcador, didn't always share. This was particularly significant when it came to the Primarchs. The Emperor's sons were the capstone of the human breeding project that had been centuries in preparation, 20 beings of extraordinary capability, each one seeded with specific aspects of the Emperor's own genetic heritage. Each one intended to lead a Space Marine Legion and to serve as the supreme commanders of the Great Crusade. Before they were found, before the heresy scattered some to darkness and others to legend, they were a secret that very few people outside the Emperor's innermost circle knew about. Valdor was in that circle. He knew about the Primarchs' existence before most people did. He knew what they were for, and roughly what the Emperor hoped they would become. And when Malcador mentioned to him that the Primarchs were alive and being sought, Valdor's response was something close to genuine surprise, which suggests that, despite his access to the Emperor's confidence, there were still things he wasn't told until the time was right. That quality in the relationship is important. Valdor trusted the Emperor completely, but not because the Emperor was transparent with him. He trusted the Emperor, despite the Emperor's fundamental inscrutability, because the evidence of everything the Master of Mankind had built and done gave Valdor sufficient confidence that whatever was being kept from him was being kept from him for good reasons. This is a rare kind of trust. It requires humility, the ability to accept that someone else's judgment might be better than your own, but it also requires a quality that's more active than humility. It requires the willingness to keep serving well, even when you don't have all the information you'd like, because the alternative, demanding complete transparency as a precondition of loyal service, would mean betraying the very relationship you're trying to honor. Valdor had that quality. He had it in an absolute degree that the Primarchs, for all their gifts, could not consistently match. And the difference between what happened to the first Custodian and what happened to the War Master Horus can be read, at least in part, as the difference between a being who kept faith when information was incomplete and a being who couldn't. By the time the Great Crusade launched, Valdor had spent decades operating at the very heart of what would become the Imperium of Man. He had fought the unification wars from within the fighting. He had managed the transition from the Thunder Warriors to the first Space Marines. He had navigated conspiracies and coups and the thousand small decisions that add up to the shape of a civilization's beginning. He had learned, through all of this, that the difference between success and failure in the kind of enterprise the Emperor was running was mostly a matter of who was watching the things that needed watching when everyone else's attention was elsewhere. That was going to be his job for a very long time. Section 5. The Great Crusade Sentinel of the Palace. The launch of the Great Crusade, when it came, was one of the most extraordinary events in human history. Fleets of a scale not seen since the Dark Age of technology moved out from Terra toward the stars. The 20 Space Marine legions, each one commanded by a Primarch who had been found and reunited with the Emperor in turn, spread across the galaxy to reclaim the human colony worlds that the Age of Strife had cut off and isolated, and, in many cases, exposed to things that had moved in during the darkness. And the Emperor went with the crusade, for a time. He led from the front in the early years, in the way that only the Emperor could lead, his presence on a battlefield not just strategically valuable but psychically significant, his mind and will pushing back the darkness of the warp wherever he went, his golden form at the tip of the spear that was driving civilization forward through chaos and alien resistance, and the accumulated consequences of 1,000 years of isolation. But as the Primarchs matured into their roles as Guilliman's administrative genius, and Horus's tactical brilliance, and Russ's ferocity, and Sanguinius's inspirational grace, and Dorn's unbreakable fortitude, all became established facts of the Crusade's operational reality. The Emperor stepped back. He returned to Terra. The great work, as some sources call it, required his attention in ways that the campaign no longer did. He had given his sons the tools and the direction. Now, he had to build what they were fighting for. And so, for much of the Great Crusade's long decades, Valdor was on Terra. This is genuinely surprising, if you think about it for a moment. The greatest individual warrior in the Imperium, the being who had fought at the cutting edge of some of the most intense military action in human history, was stationed at a palace on a core world, while the war he'd spent centuries preparing for was being fought elsewhere. The Custodians didn't go on crusade in significant numbers. They stayed close to the Emperor, which meant they stayed on Terra. But staying on Terra was not the same as having nothing to do. The Imperial Palace in this era was a different structure from what it would become, not yet the continent-spanning fortress of the Heresy era, with its void shields and its millions of defenders and its anti-orbital weapons platforms, but already an enormously complex administrative center for a growing galactic civilization. The number of people passing through its gates on any given day, the number of factions and interests and agendas colliding in its corridors, the sheer volume of information that needed to be processed and assessed and acted upon. All of this made the palace something that required constant, intelligent management simply to keep the wrong things from happening. Valdor and the Custodians provided that management. Not in a visible administrative way, the Custodians were not bureaucrats, and Valdor's interest in paperwork was approximately zero. But in the more important, less glamorous way, by watching, by assessing, by maintaining awareness of who was in the palace and what they were doing, and whether that constituted a threat to the Emperor or to the project he was building. Every diplomat who came to negotiate, every Mechanicum representative from Mars, every Legion officer taking temporary posting on Terra, every merchant or trader or minor official whose name appeared in the administrative record. Someone in the Custodian Guard was aware of each of them, had assessed each of them, had formed a judgment about whether they were what they presented themselves as being. Valdor built, during these years, something that modern readers might recognize as an intelligence apparatus, though it operated without most of the formal structures that the 41st Millennium's Inquisition would later develop. It was personal, direct, rooted in the first Custodian's own remarkable ability to read people and situations. He also, during this period, developed the relationships and the working protocols that would allow the Officio Assassinorum to function as an extension of the Emperor's will. The Master of Assassins, a role whose true occupant was for a long time Malcador the Sigillite, oversaw the various assassin clades, the Vindicare, the Calidus, the Culixus, the Eversor, the Venenum, the Vanus. But Valdor's operational relationship with these organizations meant that when he needed something done that fell within their capabilities, the channels existed to make it happen with appropriate speed and discretion. He was also, during the Great Crusade years, watching the Primarchs. Not with suspicion, not at first, but with attention. He had reports, probably through the Custodians posted to observe various legions, and through the intelligence networks he maintained, of how the Emperor's sons were developing. Some of what he read would have been deeply encouraging. The accounts of Sanguinius and his blood angels, achieving things that seemed to border on the miraculous. Of Guilliman constructing, in real time and in the field, the administrative infrastructure of a civilization that would outlast any individual in it. Of Dorn's fortifications holding against forces that should have been unstoppable. And some of what he read was less encouraging. the early signs of the divisions between the Primarchs, the philosophical conflicts that seemed trivial at first and became, in retrospect, fault lines that the enemy would eventually drive into catastrophically wide fractures. The particular darkness gathering around certain individuals, whose names would later be spoken in the same breath as the words treason and heresy. When Valdor discussed Horus Lupercal, and there is a recorded conversation in which he does this, after the heresy has begun, with another custodian who asks how this could have happened, he says something that reveals both how well he understood the War Master and how careful he was about what he said publicly about people whose fate wasn't yet determined. He rejected theories that Horus fell out of pride or resentment of the Emperor. He said that something had driven Horus and his closest advisors mad, something external, something that had gotten into them and changed them. He was right, but knowing he was right doesn't make the heresy any less catastrophic when it arrives. Section 6. The Burning of Prospero, when gold met sorcery. The burning of Prospero is one of the most tragic events of the 31st millennium, and Constantine Valdor was at the center of it, not as a driving force, not as the person who made the decision that led to the catastrophe, but as the Emperor's instrument for executing a decision whose full consequences were shaped by forces that had manipulated the situation to produce the worst possible outcome. The context requires understanding what Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons were before the fire. The 1,000 sons were a legion of scholars as much as soldiers. Magnus himself was one of the most gifted psychers in human history, second only to the Emperor among beings of human genetic heritage. And he had built his legion around the cultivation and discipline of psychic ability in ways that were, by the standards of the Great Crusade, genuinely extraordinary. The 1,000 sons were trying to understand the warp, to develop a science of psychic phenomena that would allow humanity to engage with that reality safely, rather than being victimized by it. The aspiration, if not always the execution, was one that the Emperor might have respected. What the Emperor did not respect was the breaking of his direct command. At the Council of Nicaea, he had ruled unambiguously and personally that psychic practice by the Space Marine legions was forbidden. The dangers were too great. The risk of demonic corruption through unsanctioned psychic use was not a theoretical concern, but a documented reality, and the Emperor had concluded that the potential benefit of psychic legionaries did not outweigh the cost of the risk they created. Magnus disagreed with this ruling, publicly and passionately, at the council itself, but the ruling stood, and Magnus went back to Prospero and, to his credit and his ruin, kept practicing what he'd been forbidden. Then Horus was corrupted on Davin. Then Magnus, in a desperate attempt to warn the Emperor, broke through the wards on the Emperor's secret webway project beneath the Imperial Palace, tearing a hole in the carefully maintained barriers and flooding the webway with daemons. He did this with good intentions. He genuinely believed he was saving the Emperor from treachery. He was genuinely correct about the treachery, but the method he chose, the one thing he was explicitly forbidden to do, caused a catastrophe that would force the Emperor to respond. The response that actually happened was not the response the Emperor intended. Horus interceded. The War Master convinced Lemon Russ that bringing Magnus to Terra was unnecessary, that a Primarch who had committed treason didn't deserve the mercy of a trial. And Russ, who was ferocious and direct, and not always good at distinguishing between what he'd been told to do and what he'd been convinced to do in place of it, took his space wolves and went to Prospero to destroy everything Magnus had built. The Emperor sent his own force alongside them. Valdor led this contingent of custodians granted the Emperor's seal and the right to dispense high justice within his realms, which is about as much legal authority as any individual could receive, along with Janisha Kroll of the Sisters of Silence, a substantial Imperial army presence, and several elements of the Mechanicum's battle-ready forces. What happened on Prospero was brutal in the specific way that the destruction of something beautiful is always more brutal than ordinary destruction. The 1,000 Sons had built a civilization on that planet. Tizca, their capital, was filled with libraries and academies and archives of psychic research that represented the most sophisticated body of knowledge about the warp that had ever been systematically assembled in the history of humanity. The people of Prospero were largely civilians who had lived under the Thousand Sons' protection and had, in many cases, genuinely benefited from it. When the Space Wolves dropped from orbit and the Custodians followed, and the Sisters of Silence advanced through the city's streets, with their blank presence suppressing every psychic field they touched, the destruction was comprehensive. The Thousand Sons fought back with everything they had. Their elite units, the Blade Masters, warriors who had trained to fight while maintaining active psychic shields and offense, capable of using precognition to read incoming attacks before they arrived, were formidable opponents. Valdor faced over 30 of them, and killed all 30, with one wound to show for it. The reason this feat is so frequently referenced in discussions of Valdor's capability is that the specific nature of the Blade Master's power, psychic precognition, should theoretically have made him one of the harder opponents to defeat using the techniques they'd trained against. If you can see an attack before it lands, you can respond to it. This is a genuine tactical advantage against most opponents. Against Valdor, it apparently wasn't enough, which suggests one of several things. Either his speed was such that the window between perceiving the attack and the attack arriving was too small for even enhanced reflexes to exploit, or his fighting style was sufficiently non-patterned, sufficiently responsive to the immediate moment rather than operating on predictable tactical subroutines that the precognition couldn't identify a reliable threat vector until it was already too late. Or, and this is the most interesting possibility, the Apollonian Spear's properties affected the reliability of psychic perception in its immediate vicinity, making it harder for the precognition to function clearly the closer Valdor got. The spear touched several of the greatest psychic minds of the Thousand Sons that day, and added their knowledge to the library it had been building since the Unification Wars. Prospero burned. The Thousand Sons who survived were scooped up by Tsiench's direct intervention and deposited in the Eye of Terror, where they swore service to the Architect of Fate and became, in time, the Chaos Space Marines who would plague the Imperium for millennia. Magnus the Red became a Daemon Prince. The libraries burned, the archives burned, Tizca burned, and the first battle of the Horus Heresy, though neither side knew it, yet was over. Valdor departed Prospero, with the blood of scholars on his spear, and the knowledge of those scholars absorbed into it, and the heresy was already underway, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Section 7. The Horus Heresy War comes to Terra. When Horus declared his rebellion and half the Space Marine legions turned on the Emperor, the Imperium discovered that the worst thing it had ever feared was not an external threat, but an internal one. The 9 traitor legions and their primarchs had been, individually, the most powerful military forces the human race had ever produced. Together, with the corruption of chaos empowering them, and the element of surprise on their side, and nearly a decade's worth of planning by forces both human and demonic behind them, they were something that should have been unstoppable. They weren't. But stopping them cost more than the Imperium could afford to pay. For the years between Horus's declaration and the eventual arrival of the traitor legions at Terra itself, Valdor operated on multiple fronts simultaneously, the way only a being of his capabilities could manage. He was on the War Council, the strategic body that coordinated the Imperium's response to the rebellion, alongside Malcador, Rogel Dorn, and Zagreus Kane of the Mechanicum. This was not a ceremonial position. His voice had weight in that room. His assessments shaped decisions. One of the first decisions he pushed for was the Officio Assassinorum mission against Horus. The logic was elegant in its directness. Kill the War Master. Remove the being whose personal vision and tactical genius and terrible charisma were holding the rebellion together. If Horus died, the alliance of traitor legions would fracture. They had nothing else that could serve as a coherent center of gravity, and their individual primarchs, however formidable, did not have Horus's specific quality of making people want to follow him. Rogel Dorn argued against this. Dorn's argument was that the rebellion was already too large to be ended by a single assassination, that removing Horus would simply produce a successor who might be less recognizable and therefore more dangerous, and that the Imperium's own legitimacy required it to fight rather than assassinate. There's a version of Dorn's argument that is essentially an argument about identity. We are what we do, And an Imperium that wins by killing its enemies in their beds has won something other than what we thought we were fighting for. Valdor's counter-argument was that the Imperium was not a philosophy exercise, that the Imperium had enemies who would use any means necessary, and that meeting that with restriction on principle was a luxury the situation didn't support. He used the word expedient. Dorn used the word cowardly. The argument got heated in the way that arguments between extraordinary people with incompatible but genuine commitments often do. The Emperor ended it. His ruling was that there would be no more shadows, no more veils. Whatever the mission might have accomplished was no longer the approach that served. The assassins went anyway and failed, because Horus had been warned, and the agent they sent killed a body double, while the War Master watched from a safe distance, and the war continued along the lines that Dorn's approach implied. Valdor adapted. He always adapted. As the heresy progressed, the specific threat to Terra became more immediate and more complex. The war in the Webway, the ongoing battle against the demonic incursion that Magnus's psychic breach had made possible, raging through the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, consumed a significant portion of the Custodian's strength. Valdor's 10,000 were supposed to be the Emperor's primary military reserve, deployable to any location where the Legio Custodes was needed. But with large numbers of them locked into the Webway conflict, managing the constant pressure of entities trying to push through from the immaterial realm, the resources available for other purposes were reduced. He made it work. He tracked the traitor movements through his intelligence networks, positioned the available custodians where they would be most effective, managed the political and military relationships with the loyalist Space Marine forces that were trying to coordinate through the chaos of a war being fought on 10,000 worlds simultaneously, and he kept building contingencies. The lore notes that, during the final stages of the siege, while others were focused entirely on the immediate battle, Valdor was also thinking about what would happen if the Emperor failed. What would need to be in place? What could not be allowed to be lost? The siege of Terra itself, when it came after years of the traitor legions fighting their way across the rest of the Imperium toward the heart of it, was the single most concentrated act of violence in human history. The numbers involved, the scale of the fighting, the combination of conventional military conflict and demonic incursion and psychic assault, and the simple desperate horror of the greatest fortress humanity had ever built, being systematically dismantled by forces that had once built it. All of it combined into something that made even the unification wars look small. Valdor fought in the siege alongside Jagatai Khan and Raldoran at the Colossi Gate, pushing back demonic forces that were pressing through the defenses at points where the veil between the material world and the warp had grown thin enough to tear. He coordinated the Custodian deployment across the palace walls. He hunted Basilio Foe through corridors that were themselves becoming battlefields, the mad scientist's anti-Astartes bioweapon representing a threat that needed to be controlled before it became a weapon in the wrong hands. He attended the councils that still met in the deep rooms of the palace to try to impose some structure on a defense that was collapsing in stages. And when the shields of the vengeful spirit came down, and the Emperor saw his chance, an Operation Anabasis was assembled in the dead of a night that might be the last night the Imperium would ever know Valdor was there. Section 8. The Vengeful Spirit Darkness aboard the Archtraitor's throne. The operation called Anabasis was assembled in the early hours of the siege's final stage. 4 companies, teleporting to 4 different points aboard the Vengeful Spirit simultaneously, each one charged with fighting toward the center where Horus waited. Malcador had already taken the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne, the act of sacrifice that would slowly destroy him over the course of the coming battle. The Emperor himself led the Heteron Guard directly toward Lupercal's court. Sanguinius, already exhausted and wounded from fighting Angron and Kabanda, carrying injuries that a Primarch's body hadn't fully recovered from, was ahead of them. Rogel Dorn led the Imperial Fist's Huskarls, and Valdor led his Custodians into a different quadrant of the ship, teleporting into whatever that section of the Vengeful Spirit had become. What they arrived in was darkness. Not just the absence of light darkness as a presence, a condition, something projected by the corruption that had been eating the ship from the inside for years. The Vengeful Spirit was no longer entirely a material vessel. It was merging with the warp at the edges, its architecture becoming increasingly non-Euclidean, its corridors sometimes connecting places that shouldn't be adjacent, its interior echoing with the sounds of things that didn't have bodies but had intentions. And then the daemons came. The lore describes the assault on Valdor's company as a wave, not a wall of soldiers, but something more like a tide of entities, pouring from the accumulated darkness of a ship that had spent years being slowly transformed into a temple of chaos. They were too numerous to count, and the counting was irrelevant. What mattered was that they kept coming, and that each one needed to be destroyed, and that the Apollonian spear and the weapons of the Custodians were equal to that task, but only if the warriors wielding them didn't make mistakes. Custodians don't make many mistakes. Valdor makes essentially none. He stabbed the Apollonian spear into the deck of the ship to confirm where they were. The spear touched the corrupted metal of the vengeful spirit and read it, told him what it was, confirmed that he was aboard the enemy flagship and not some warp construct designed to trap them somewhere useful to the enemy. Then he pulled it free and kept fighting. He felt fear during this sequence. The lore is specific about this, and it's remarkable precisely because it's specific. Not fear of the daemons, not fear of the darkness or the chaos or the possibility of his own death. Fear that he wouldn't reach the Emperor in time. Fear that the thing he existed to prevent the Emperor being in danger without Valdor present to do something about it was happening right now. Ahead of him, beyond the wall of demonic resistance, and that no matter how efficiently he killed, he might not close the distance in time. For a being who had spent his entire existence managing the gap between emotion and function with extraordinary skill, that was a crack in the wall. The lore doesn't suggest it compromised his performance in any measurable way. He kept moving, kept killing, kept pushing toward the Emperor's location with the same mechanical precision that he always brought to combat. But he felt it, and he carried it. When the demonic assault thinned enough for the company to push deeper into the ship, they encountered resistance of a different kind, sons of Horus, word-bearers, the traitor legionnaires who had come aboard to ensure their master's victory, or at least to ensure that nothing interfered with the final confrontation. These were opponents who fought in recognizable ways, with tactics and weapons that the Custodians' training had prepared them for. And then Valdor saw Abaddon. Ezekiel Abaddon, the first captain of the Sons of Horus, was even then one of the most dangerous individuals in the galaxy. In the millennia that would follow, he would become something even worse, the despoiler, the leader of the Black Legion, the architect of catastrophes that would shake the Imperium to its foundations, and eventually crack the galaxy open along the fault lines of the Great Rift. But in this moment, he was a warrior at the height of his physical capability, empowered by warp rituals that his allies had performed to give him an edge in the most important battle of his life. And he brought with him a force of Justeran Terminators and veteran word-bearers that outnumbered Valdor's surviving Custodians by more than 30-1. The details of what followed are captured in fragmented form across several sources, and they don't always agree on the specifics. But the broad shape is consistent. Valdor and his company fought. They were already wounded from the demonic assault. They were already reduced in number. The fresh, warp-empowered force they faced was the worst possible matchup for what they had left. Valdor himself was wounded by Hellas Sykar, a chaos champion whose power sword drove through his armor at a moment when the geometry of the fight made the usual perfect response unavailable and continued fighting with the bolt, lodged where it had gone. And then he struck Abaddon with the Apollonian spear. The moment of contact, the fraction of a second when the blade's edge met the first captain's flesh, and in that moment, the spear did what it always did. It showed Valdor the truth. He hadn't even 10,000 years. Not every detail, not every event, not a clear narrative of what would happen, the lore, doesn't suggest that level of precision. But the shape of it, the broad, terrible shape of what Abaddon would become, and what he would do, and what the galaxy would look like at the far end of 10 millennia of the Despoiler's work. The Great Rift torn through reality. The Black Crusades. The burning of worlds. The slow, grinding darkness closing in around the Imperium from every direction. He named Abaddon what he would become, Despoiler. It was not a title the first captain had yet earned. It was a prophecy spoken in a single word by a man who had just seen the future burn. Rogel Dorn arrived at a critical moment, and the equation shifted enough that Abaddon's counterattack was broken. The surviving Custodians and Dorn's warriors pushed on to Lupercal's court. They arrived to find Horus dead, killed by the Emperor in an exchange that had shattered both of them. Garviel Loken and a Custodian named Litu were the only other survivors in the room. The Emperor was alive, but so barely alive that the distinction felt almost academic. His body had been destroyed. What was keeping the light of his consciousness present in the material world at all was a mystery even to the people looking at him. Valdor wept. The lore records this with a specific, economical bluntness. He and the other surviving Custodians wept when they saw the state of the Emperor. Whether this was the controlled grief of warriors who had loved something and lost it, or something less controlled and more raw. The sudden crack opening in that wall between what Valdor felt and what Valdor showed isn't specified. It doesn't need to be. The first Custodian, the being who had built a career out of serving his function with complete emotional composure, looked at the ruin of the person he'd given everything to protect, and he wept. The decision to bring the Emperor to the Golden Throne was made in those moments. A tarot card was found. The throne in Dorne argued that this was the path. Valdor dismissed the superstition of interpreting a found card as guidance, but the practical logic held regardless of the omen, and so the Emperor was carried back to Terra, to the device that had been built for a completely different purpose, and was now being repurposed as a life support system for the most important being in human history. Valdor helped carry him there. Section 9. After the silence, the Emperor falls, and Valdor watches. The immediate aftermath of the Siege of Terra is a period that the lore covers with less detail than the siege itself, which is appropriate because much of what happened in those weeks and months has the character of people in shock, trying to maintain function while processing something that their minds hadn't yet found a frame for. The Emperor was on the throne. He was alive, in some sense of the word. The psychic output. He was generating the Astronomicon that guided humanity's ships through the warp. The sustained pressure he put on the forces of chaos, simply by existing and maintaining a focused consciousness, was real and measurable and absolutely critical to the survival of the Imperium. If he died, if the throne failed, if the light of his consciousness went out entirely, the consequences would be immediate and devastating. The Astronomicon would fail. The warp would surge. The Imperium would lose the navigational infrastructure that allowed it to function at all. In practical terms, its civilization would begin to collapse within years. So the throne had to be maintained, and the Emperor had to be kept at whatever threshold of existence he was currently occupying. Valdor stayed close. He worked with Zagreus Kane and the Adnectar Concilium, the Mechanicum specialists, in the operation and maintenance of the Golden Throne systems to ensure that the infrastructure supporting the Emperor's continued existence was as robust as possible. This was not combat. It was not espionage. It was the grinding, technical, spiritually devastating work of tending to a life support system for a god who was simultaneously the only thing standing between humanity and annihilation. He also attended the Grand Council of Reconstruction, where the surviving loyalist leadership attempted to determine what the Imperium would look like going forward. Rogel Dorn and Roboute Guilliman, who had arrived too late for the siege itself, but was present for its aftermath, argued about the structure of the Space Marine legions, about governance, about whether the decentralization that Guilliman was proposing in his Codex Astartes was wisdom or cowardice. The argument was real, and the stakes were real, and both men had genuine points. Valdor sat in that council and said nothing. He participated in its deliberations without contributing a position on the questions being debated. He didn't favor Dorn's approach over Guilliman's, or vice versa. He didn't advocate for any particular vision of what the Imperium should become in the Emperor's absence. This isn't apathy, it's something more specific. Valdor's loyalty was to the Emperor, to the actual specific being whose vision had shaped the Imperium and who was now sealed away and unable to guide it. He didn't know what the Emperor would want the Imperium to become in these new circumstances, because the Emperor hadn't told him, and the Emperor couldn't now be asked. To pick a side in the debate between Dorn and Guilliman would be to substitute his own judgment for the Emperor's, and that was not something Valdor was willing to do. He maintained the vigil, he stayed at the heart of things. He watched the Imperium begin to evolve away from what the Emperor had designed, in all the small and large ways that an institution drifts from its original intentions when its founder is no longer present to correct the drift. Lemon Russ came to Terra in the aftermath of the siege to return something that had been borrowed during the chaos of the war. During that brief visit, Valdor expressed his views on psychic practices in the Space Marine legions with his characteristic directness. His opinion on the Space Wolves' rune priests was unfavorable. He considered them no different from the kind of psychic practice that the Council of Nicaea had forbidden, and he said so. This tells us something important. Even in the immediate aftermath of the worst event in human history, even surrounded by the wreckage of a civilization still smoking from the siege of Terra, Valdor was thinking about principles rather than just pragmatics. The Emperor's actual edicts still mattered to him. The actual intentions behind those edicts still mattered to him. Not what was convenient or what had become politically acceptable, but what the Emperor had actually said. This is a quality that becomes more significant when you think about it in the context of what the Imperium would become over the next 10,000 years. The Emperor had, among other things, been opposed to being worshipped as a god. He had been opposed to the kind of blind religious devotion that replaced rational understanding with faith-based obedience. He had intended the Webway Project to give humanity safe passage through the immaterial realm rather than having to rely on warp travel and its attendant dangers. He had intended the Primarchs to serve as the backbone of a lasting civilization, not to be lost to heresy or banishment or death one by one. He had intended humanity to eventually transcend its dependence on him, to become strong enough to stand without the Astronomicon, without the Golden Throne, without a single being holding back the darkness by sheer force of will. None of those intentions survived the heresy intact. The God Emperor became a religion. The Webway Project was abandoned. The Primarchs were scattered or corrupted or gone. The Imperium became a calcified theocracy rather than the rationalist, expansionist civilization the Emperor had designed. Valdor knew all of this. He had been present when the Emperor's actual plans were being made. He knew the difference between what the Imperium was becoming and what it was supposed to be. And at some point, the lore doesn't give us the specific moment of decision, just the outcome. He concluded that the gap between those two things was too large to be bridged from inside the existing institutions, and that doing what needed to be done required operating outside them. Section 10. The disappearance only in death. The night Valdor left the Imperial Palace, nothing marked the moment as significant. No alarm was raised. No ceremony marked it. No council was convened to witness it. He walked through corridors he had walked through for a century, through gates he had guarded against enemies that would never come, past the chambers and the meeting rooms and the maintenance passageways of a structure that was already beginning, its long transformation from a working building into something more like a cathedral, a place of worship whose function was defined by the being at its center rather than by practical work of governance. He paused at some point along the way, turned back, let his eyes rest on the palace, on the thing it contained, on everything it represented, the dream and the disaster of it, the extraordinary aspiration and the terrible cost, the future it was supposed to serve and the wounded, attenuated version of that future that had actually arrived. He said, "Only in death." Then he went. The full saying is, "Only in death does duty end." It is perhaps the most famous single phrase in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, repeated across every culture and institution in the Imperium, invoked by everything from Space Marine chapters to guard regiments to the various orders of the Mechanicum. It is a statement about commitment, about the idea that certain obligations cannot be laid down, that once you have taken on a duty of sufficient magnitude, it becomes part of what you are and continues until you stop existing. Valdor said the first half of it and walked away. The interpretive tradition around this moment is rich and, appropriately, unresolved. The simplest reading, and the most painful, is that Valdor was marking the Emperor's functional death, not biological death. The Emperor's biological status was genuinely ambiguous, genuinely uncertain, even to the most sophisticated medical analysis the Mechanicum could bring to bear on it. But functional death, the death of the active, engaged, speaking, guiding presence that Valdor had spent his entire existence serving. That presence was gone. What remained in the Golden Throne was something the lore has spent 10,000 years arguing about whether it's the Emperor in any meaningful sense, whether there's genuine consciousness and will behind the psychic output, whether the being Valdor had known was in any way still present. If the Emperor was functionally dead, then duty had ended. Valdor was free. But free to do what? This is where the simplest reading breaks down. A being who has spent his entire existence in service to a specific vision doesn't walk into the dark simply because that vision's architect can no longer speak. He walks into the dark because the vision still exists, even if the person who articulated it can no longer guide its execution. He walks into the dark because doing what the vision requires has become impossible within the existing structure, and the existing structure has become something the vision would not recognize. In other words, maybe only in death wasn't a farewell. Maybe it was a declaration of intent. The duty that the living emperor could observe and approve and correct has ended. What comes next is duty of a different kind, one that operates beyond the formal structures of the Imperium, beyond the oversight of its institutions, beyond the political constraints that bind everyone who remains within the system. The Adeptus Custodes doesn't know where he went. They maintain his absence in their records as one of 3 captains general whose fate is genuinely unknown. The broader Imperium, to the extent that it knows his name at all after 10,000 years, treats him as a historical figure, the first of the 10,000, a legend from the founding era, someone whose deeds are celebrated in the abstract, without any particular expectation that they might be ongoing. But somewhere in the galaxy, something has been working. Something with resources that shouldn't exist, connections that shouldn't be possible, and a degree of patience that only a very old being with a very long-term goal could sustain. And, 10,000 years later, a pair of inquisitors started following the trail. Section 11. The King in Yellow Shadow of a Legend. The Inquisitors, Gregor Eisenhorn and Gideon Ravenor, are, by any standard, 2 of the most formidable operatives the Ordos have ever produced. They have between them, across their documented careers, faced and defeated enemies that would have ended ordinary campaigns. They have dealt with chaos cults, alien incursions, demonic possessions, warp breaches, political conspiracies at the highest level of imperial society, and the kind of deep, slow corruption that takes decades to unravel. They are not easily surprised, not easily deceived, not easily afraid. The King in Yellow made them afraid. Dan Abnett's Bequin trilogy, Pariah, Penitent, and the forthcoming conclusion is where the King in Yellow material lives in the Black Library fiction, and what Abnett has built across these books is genuinely extraordinary. The King is described, in the accounts of people who've encountered him or his agents, as a figure of enormous presence and equally enormous inscrutability. He seems to have influence everywhere and a face nowhere. He has cultivated relationships across the entirety of the human and non-human galaxy over what appears to be an extremely long period of time. He commands resources that include not just operatives and weapons, but entire institutions that may have been built specifically to serve his long-term purposes. The Inquisition, encountering evidence of his work, concluded that the King in Yellow was a threat of the First Order, a being working against the Imperium, possibly in service to chaos, possibly something even less categorizable. They pursued him across the Bequin trilogy's storyline with the dedication of people who had identified an enemy and were committed to understanding and stopping it. They were, in the way the Bequin trilogy consistently plays with the reader's assumptions, looking at it from exactly the wrong angle. Elizabeth Bequin, an extraordinarily capable operative in her own right, with a complex history involving the Cognitae, the Inquisition, and the kind of dangerous knowledge that tends to find people rather than the other way around, entered a pocket dimension called the City of Dust during the investigation. This was a space that exists outside both the material universe and the warp, an extimate space, as the lore calls it, the kind of place that shouldn't exist, that requires an extraordinary combination of knowledge, power, and vision to create and maintain. She was almost brought before the king. She used Enuncia, the primordial language, one of the most dangerous forms of knowledge in the galaxy, words that can reshape reality when spoken correctly to escape. In the process, her investigation recovered something, a book. Not an ordinary book, not even an extraordinary ordinary book, but a text whose entire content was apparently a single thing, the identity of the king in yellow, encoded in a hexagrammatic cipher so complex that it took Gideon Ravenor years to decode it. The first words of the decoded text were, Constantine Valdor. Now, the lore doesn't confirm this absolutely. It presents it as the finding of an investigation, with all the uncertainty that implies. The cipher could have been planted. The book could have been a trap. The name could be misdirection, a blind, something designed to make the Inquisition think they'd identified their target when they'd actually been pointed in a direction useful to someone else. But the thematic logic of it is so consistent with everything the lore shows us about Valdor's character, his capabilities, his known access to the Emperor's deepest plans, and his likely motivations for vanishing, that taking it seriously seems appropriate. Let's take it seriously, while acknowledging the uncertainty, and see where it leads. If Valdor is the King in Yellow, then the King in Yellow's activities look completely different. The vast network of contacts and agents across the Imperium and beyond. For someone who built the Imperium's first intelligence apparatus, who spent decades maintaining awareness of every person and faction and threat that touched the palace, building that kind of network over 10,000 years would not be remarkable. It would be exactly what you'd expect. The interest in Enuncia and the collection of that most dangerous of knowledge systems. Enuncia is, in the understanding the lore provides, the primordial language of creation, words that predate human language, that resonate with the fundamental structures of reality itself. If you were trying to do something that required engaging with reality at its most fundamental level, something like closing the warp off from the material universe, or finding and speaking a name that carries genuine power over the thing it names Enuncia, is what you'd need. The collection of pariahs. Blank individuals, people whose psychic signature is the absolute absence of one, are to the warp what certain materials are to electricity, complete insulators. They cannot be detected by psychic means. They are invisible to daemons. Their presence disrupts psychic activity in their vicinity. An army of them would be, to warp-based threats, essentially impossible to engage through the usual methods. If you were building a force intended specifically to fight the forces of chaos on their own terms, pariahs would be the core of it. The extimate space, the city of dust, the webway. The Emperor's original project had been to give humanity access to a network of stable passages through a space between the warp and the material universe, safe from the dangers of both. That project was destroyed when Magnus broke through its wards and the daemons poured in. But the knowledge of how to create extimate spaces, how to maintain pockets of reality that exist outside the normal architecture of the universe, that knowledge was the Emperor's, and Valdor was one of the very few people who had access to what the Emperor knew. The Eldar response. Some accounts suggest that the Eldar have mobilized significant forces, multiple craft worlds to deal with whatever the King in Yellow is building. The Eldar are old enough and wise enough to understand when something represents a genuine existential threat, and they don't expend resources casually. If multiple craft worlds are responding to one individual's activities, that individual is doing something that the Eldar, who have more contact with warp entities and more direct knowledge of chaos's nature than almost any human source, consider genuinely significant. Put all of this together, and you get a picture of a 10,000-year project that looks like this. A being with complete knowledge of the Emperor's original plan, operating outside the Imperium's institutions and below the awareness of chaos, assembling the tools, the knowledge, the people, and the infrastructure necessary to do something that the current Imperium literally cannot do for itself, something that the Emperor couldn't complete before the heresy interrupted everything, something that requires the kind of patient, comprehensive preparation that only an extremely long-lived being with an absolutely singular focus could sustain. The theories about what specifically that something is have filled forums and discussion threads for years. The most compelling ones converge on a few possibilities. Valdor may be working to resurrect the Emperor, not in the sense of simply maintaining his existence on the throne, but in the sense of finding a way to restore the full, active, speaking, guiding presence that was lost when Horus's attack drove the master of mankind into the burning prison of psychic sustenance he currently occupies. This would require something extraordinary, probably multiple extraordinary things, and the assembly of Annuncia, pariahs, extimate space, and a network of agents who understand the project seems consistent with what such an effort would need. Alternatively, Valdor may be working to complete the Webway project, to create a safe route for humanity through the spaces between the warp and the material universe, rendering the Imperium less dependent on warp travel and the Astronomicon, less vulnerable to the specific catastrophic vulnerability that the current state of things represents. This would also explain the extimate space expertise and the pariah collection. The most radical theory, and the one that some of the Annuncia references support most directly, is that Valdor is working towards something even more fundamental, a way to damage or diminish the Chaos Gods themselves, to affect the immaterial universe in ways that would reduce or eliminate the existential threat that the ruinous powers represent. If you wanted to do that, you'd need the primordial language of creation. You'd need to understand the warp better than anyone in the Imperium currently does. You'd need a force that could operate in that context without being detectable by the entities you were targeting, and you'd need to have been working on it for a very long time. What's consistent across all of these theories is this. Whatever Valdor is doing, he hasn't given up on what the Emperor wanted. He has not gone rogue. He has not turned to chaos. He has not despaired or surrendered, or decided that the darkness is stronger than the will to resist it. He made a calculation about what needed to be done and what the existing structures could and could not accomplish, and he went outside those structures to do the things they couldn't. This is very much in character for the being who let Candywire go, who saved Basilio Foe from the Night Lord and decided that a weapon capable of killing Primarchs might be useful to the Emperor, who deployed the Officio Assassinorum against Horus over Rogel Dorn's objections, not out of bloodthirst, but out of a cold-eyed assessment that some threats are better neutralized by the most direct and efficient means available. Valdor has never been bound by the narrow interpretation of his mandate. He has always served the purpose, not the procedure, and 10,000 years of purpose, pursued with the patience and the precision that only he possesses, may be close to completing something. The book that Ravenor decoded contained a countdown. The lore's handling of this detail is appropriately cryptic, but the suggestion is clear. Whatever has been building is close to ready. Whatever was set in motion when Valdor walked out of the Imperial Palace on a quiet night after the heresy's end, it is approaching some moment of resolution. The galaxy of the 41st millennium has enough darkness in it that one more extraordinary threat would not be surprising. What would be surprising genuinely, historically surprising, in the way that only things which have been building for a very long time can be, is the emergence of something that might actually be a solution. Section 12. Legacy, Theory, and What Comes Next. To try to contain Constantine Valdor in any kind of final assessment is to run up against the specific quality that makes him the most compelling character in Warhammer 40,000. For many of the people who know his story, he isn't done yet. His legacy exists in multiple forms simultaneously. There is the legacy of what he built. The Legio Custodes, the 10,000, still stand their vigil on Terra. They still guard the gates of the Imperial Palace. They still embody the standard that Valdor set. Individual excellence beyond anything a mass-produced military force can achieve. Absolute loyalty to the Emperor's actual will, rather than to institutional interpretations of it. The willingness to act without instruction when action is clearly what the situation requires. For 10,000 years they have maintained this, and they maintain it still, even in an era when the Great Rift has torn the galaxy and the darkness presses in more acutely than at any point since the Siege of Terra. The Valdor Tank Hunter bears his name, one of the most powerful and distinctive armored vehicles in the Imperial arsenal, named in honor of the being who proved that the individual at the peak of their capability could be as decisive as entire armies at the lower end of theirs. There is the legacy in the tabletop game. In Warhammer, the Horus Heresy, the miniature game set in the 31st millennium, Valdor exists as a model and a set of rules at the absolute apex of what any non-Primarch can do. His stat line is, by honest assessment, extraordinary. He is genuinely capable of fighting most of the Primarchs to a standstill and defeating some of them outright. His Apollonian Spear's rules reflect both its physical lethality and something of its special properties. His unique ability, Lightning Blows, where a roll of 6 on the attack die inflicts 2 hits instead of 1, was considered so distinctively his that it was removed from the standard Guardian Spear profile and made exclusive to him specifically. He costs a fraction of what a Primarch costs in points, and provides a level of capability that makes him genuinely competitive against those far more expensive options. There is the legacy in the fiction. Chris rates Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, gives him more interiority than the broad lore summaries manage more access to what he actually thinks and feels, more space for the character, underneath the function, to be visible. Dan Abnett's Bequin trilogy is building to what may be the most significant lore development in the 40,000 setting in years, and if the King in Yellow resolution is what the available evidence suggests it might be, Valdor's story is heading toward a finale that 10,000 years of build-up would justify. But beyond the specific narrative and tabletop artifacts, what does Valdor represent? In a setting that is defined by darkness and despair, by the grinding, inevitable horror of a civilization fighting a losing battle against forces too vast and too numerous and too deep to ever fully defeat, Valdor is a particular kind of exception. He's not the exception who is secretly corrupted, who turns out to be a villain, who demonstrates that the darkness wins, eventually, even over the best that humanity has to offer. He's not the exception who achieved something extraordinary and then was consumed by it, leaving behind only a legend and a cautionary tale. He is the exception that the setting almost never allows. The person who was built for a purpose, served that purpose with absolute fidelity, paid costs that the purpose extracted without complaint or compensation, and then when the immediate context of that purpose was destroyed, found a way to keep serving it. 10,000 years. In a galaxy where the average human life is perhaps 50 or 60 years. In a setting where even the most durable and capable beings eventually break under the weight of what they're carrying. 10,000 years of service to a vision whose original author can no longer speak, without recognition, without the comfort of being understood by the institutions he might have gone to for support, without the certainty that what he was building would ever be used or would ever work. That's devotion of a kind that the word doesn't adequately capture. The Thunder Warriors burned bright and fast and turned against their creator when they understood they were being discarded. The Primarchs were extraordinary, but fractured under the weight of their own complexity and the manipulation of enemies who understood their flaws better than they did. The Space Marine legions and later chapters produced remarkable individuals across 10,000 years, but also fell to corruption, hubris, obsession, and the slow, grinding moral compromise that comes from fighting an endless war. Valdor just kept going. He kept going because the work wasn't finished. He kept going because the Emperor's vision, the actual vision, not the religious franchise that grew up around it, not the institutional compromise that replaced it, not the simplified and weaponized version that the Imperium uses to maintain order, was worth completing, and someone who understood it needed to be working on it. He kept going because giving up is what the darkness wants you to do, and one of the things that makes Valdor specifically remarkable is that he has never, as far as anyone can determine, done what the darkness wanted. The question of whether he succeeds is the question the lore hasn't answered yet. If the countdown is real, and the moment is approaching, and the King in Yellow's plans are finally ready for their completion, then the 41st millennium may be about to experience something that all its dark certainties haven't prepared it for. The return of someone who was there at the beginning, who knows what it was supposed to be, who has spent more time working toward the Emperor's actual intentions than anyone else alive, because everyone else who knew what those intentions were is dead or imprisoned or locked in the burning transcendence of a god's necessary sacrifice. There is something in the Warhammer 40,000 setting that resists this kind of hope. The grimdark aesthetic is real, and it's powerful, and it earns its darkness. The universe is genuinely terrible. The enemies are genuinely overwhelming. The cost of survival is genuinely more than any reasonable accounting would accept as necessary. But the Golden Warrior with the spear that tells him the truth has been working in the dark for 10,000 years. And truth, the spear has been teaching him all this time, is the one thing that endures even when everything else fails. The truth of what the Emperor intended. The truth of what humanity could be. The truth that was visible at the beginning of the Unification Wars, when an impossible idea started the process of becoming real, and that remains visible now, obscured but not extinguished, waiting in the dark for the moment when someone who still remembers it can bring it into the light. Only in death does duty end. He said the first half, and kept working. Maybe the full sentence is still being written. Maybe the duty hasn't ended yet, because he hasn't died yet, because there are still things left to do, and he is still the person to do them. Maybe, in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, there is still also Constantine Valdor, still watching, still waiting, still ready. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you have my deepest, most genuine appreciation. Stories like Valdor's are the reason I started doing this. There's a particular kind of character who rewards you for paying attention, who reveals more the longer you look, and Valdor is one of the most perfect examples of that in all of Warhammer 40,000. He doesn't announce himself. He doesn't demand recognition. He just does what needs to be done, with a completeness and a quiet dignity that I find personally extraordinary. If this sparked something for you, a theory I didn't cover, a piece of lore that fits differently in light of what we've gone through tonight, a connection between Valdor and some other corner of the setting that I should have mentioned, I genuinely want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. These discussions are one of the most valuable things about making content like this, and I read more of them than you'd probably expect. If you're not already subscribed and you found this worthwhile, please do consider hitting that button. It makes a real, direct difference to what I can do here, and I have a great deal more planned, more deep dives, more atmospheric storytelling, more of the quiet histories, and the vast, strange, beautiful, and terrible universe that Warhammer 40,000 keeps unfolding the longer you look at it. Rest well, the vigil continues. And somewhere out there, a golden warrior with a spear that tells him the truth is still on duty. His watch is not yet ended. End of script. Extended section. The nature of the Custodian mind, what it means to be the Emperor's own. There is a conversation that never gets enough attention in most lore discussions about Constantine Valdor, and it's one that Thunder Warrior General Yushotan had with him during the Unification Wars. It's brief and it's brutal, and it cuts through to something that the polished, heroic narrative around the first Custodian tends to smooth over. Yushotan looked at Valdor and told him that he had all the humanity sucked out of him, and Valdor did not disagree. In a different kind of story, this would be the setup for a redemption arc, a scene establishing that our hero has lost himself and needs to find something to reconnect him to his humanity, and will have adventures and relationships that accomplish that reconnection and emerge at the end of it more whole than he was at the beginning. This is a very popular story structure. It's popular because it resonates with something real about how people work, how we can lose ourselves in function and duty, and then find our way back through love or friendship or some particular irreducible moment that cuts through all the armor. But Valdor's story isn't quite that structure, and understanding why requires sitting with what Yushotan said more carefully. The Thunder Warriors were humans in a way that Valdor had possibly never been. They were humans who had been modified into something extreme, but the core of them, the fear and rage and love and grief that drove them, the specific individual humanness that made Yushotan capable of dark humor and genuine loyalty, and the kind of grief that came from understanding you were being discarded by the person you'd bled for, that core was never touched. It was amplified in some ways. The modifications made their emotions as large as everything else about them, but it was always there. Valdor's transformation had been more complete. The rebuilding was more total. What it left behind was not the absence of feeling, but something more like the discipline of feeling, the ability to exist in a specific relationship with his emotions, where they were real but not primary, present but not controlling. He could feel fondness. He demonstrably felt grief when people he cared about died. He felt something like admiration for Yushotan. He felt something like pride in the custodians he trained and commanded. And at the end of the Siege of Terra, when he looked at what had been done to the Emperor, he wept. These are not the responses of a being without humanity. They are the responses of a being who has maintained something human underneath the function, but who has maintained it at such cost and with such discipline that the outside world sees only the discipline and concludes the humanity isn't there. The question is, what does maintaining that relationship cost? What does it do to a person over decades and then centuries and then millennia to live inside that particular kind of control. The sci-fi author's typical answer is that it produces damage, that what looks like emotional discipline from the outside is actually emotional suppression, and that suppressed emotion eventually finds its expression in ways that the person can't control or predict. Rage, grief, a kind of slow, silent fracturing that eventually becomes visible in the form of a crisis. Valdor's lore doesn't quite support this picture. There's no recorded moment where his composure breaks down catastrophically, no documented crisis of function that would indicate the cost of his discipline coming due in the usual dramatic way. What there is, instead, is a quieter version of the same thing, a gradual accumulation of truths that the Apollonian spear has given him, each one adding to a body of understanding that has no analog in anyone else's experience, a growing awareness, over centuries, of the gap between what the Emperor intended and what the Imperium was becoming, and eventually, a decision taken in private, enacted quietly, announced only to the Dark Palace and to the stars above it, that the work required a different kind of service than the one he'd been performing. This is not the fracturing of a damaged psyche. It's the decision of a very old, very wise, very complete being who has assessed a situation with perfect clarity and acted on the assessment. The departure from the palace is not a breakdown. It's a plan. But the plan required accepting something that most beings, however extraordinary, would find genuinely difficult: the dissolution of the identity he'd built over a lifetime of service, the first custodian, the captain general, the shield of the emperor. All of these things required him to be at the center of the empire's power structure, visible and present and recognizable. Whatever he went to do next required him to be none of those things, required him to put down the identity and become something unrecognizable, operating in the dark under a name that meant nothing to anyone who knew the original. He became the King in Yellow. He became a mystery. He became, in the eyes of the Inquisitors, who eventually found traces of his work, a threat. He became, to the historians, who noted his disappearance and had nothing to say about what followed, a blank page at the end of an extraordinary record. And he kept working. There is something in this that feels like the completion of a circle. At the beginning, there was a child whose parents were killed and who was taken and remade into something that served a specific purpose. At the end, or rather, at what might be the beginning of the actual end, there is a being who has spent 10,000 years remade again, this time by his own choice, into something that serves that same purpose, in a way that even the person who originally defined it might not have anticipated. The Emperor saw something in the child and moved armies to retrieve it. The child grew into the first custodian and spent centuries being the most faithful servant the Emperor had ever had. The first custodian watched his master become imprisoned in a throne that was supposed to be a tool, and became instead a final home, and made a decision. And the decision was, at its heart, the same as the Emperor's original project: use whatever is available, spare nothing, pursue the goal until the goal is achieved, or you no longer exist to pursue it. Valdor learned that from the Emperor, after all. The Emperor was not a being who let resources sit unused. He was not a being who accepted limitations without first testing whether they were real. He was not a being who concluded that something was impossible until every available option had been exhausted, and then some options that hadn't been available had been created. The King in Yellow, if it is Valdor, is the Emperor's student doing what the teacher would have done, working with whatever was available, testing every limitation, creating options that didn't exist before, pursuing the goal past the point where any reasonable assessment would have concluded it was unachievable. Maybe that's what the Emperor saw in the child, not just the raw capability that the modification process would amplify, but the quality underneath the capability, the refusal to accept a final answer when there might still be one more question to ask. Extended section: the Apollonian spear and what it knew. The Apollonian spear has been present throughout this entire story, and it deserves a dedicated moment because the implications of what it does taken seriously and followed to their logical conclusion are some of the most extraordinary things in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Let's start with what it is, physically. It's a guardian spear. The standard weapon of the Custodian Guard combines a power blade with an integrated bolter, and the power blade component, works the way power weapons always work in this universe. A field of disruptive energy surrounds the edge, allowing it to cut through materials that would stop an ordinary blade by disrupting the molecular bonds at the point of contact. The integrated bolter fires explosive rounds at ranges that put the wielder at a meaningful distance from most melee threats, while still operating in the same general engagement space as the spear's reach. The Apollonian spear's versions of these two components are significantly better than the standard Custodian equivalents. The power blade is sharper, more precisely focused, more destructive on contact. The bolter component fires with a precision and force that exceeds what even standard Custodian weaponry achieves. This is the Emperor's personal craftsmanship. Everything he makes is at the ceiling of what the technology and knowledge of his era can produce. And this weapon was made for the specific individual he had identified as the best warrior he would ever build. But then there's the other property, the ability to absorb the memories and experiences of those the spear kills, or, in an alternative formulation, to reveal the true nature of whatever it touches in the moment of killing. The lore uses slightly different language in different sources, which may reflect genuine ambiguity about how the property works, whether it's an exact record of stored memories, or something more like a compressed essential truth, or may simply reflect the difficulty of describing something that has no precise analog in ordinary experience. Whichever formulation you prefer, the implications are the same. Every kill Valdor has made with that weapon has added to him. Not just the tactical experience of having faced and defeated a particular type of enemy, which any veteran fighter accumulates over time, but something more direct and more intimate, the actual knowledge, the actual understanding, the actual inner experience of the person or entity he killed. Now consider the range of beings that the Apollonian spear has touched over the course of Valdor's career. The warriors of Maul and Sen, those who had been modified and corrupted by chaos-adjacent forces, carry in their deaths some understanding of what that corruption does from the inside, how it feels to be reshaped by something dark, how the slide from ordinary human ambition into genuine demonic service progresses step by step. The Thousand Sons Blademasters on Prospero, the psychic scholars of a legion that was specifically dedicated to understanding the warp, carry in their deaths the most sophisticated understanding of the immaterial universe that any human scholars had ever assembled. Magnus's legion was studying the warp as a field of inquiry, with genuine scientific rigor. Whatever they understood when they died, the Apollonian spear absorbed. The daemons killed during the war in the Webway and throughout the Siege of Terra. Daemons are, in the 40,000 cosmology, not simply monsters. They are entities of the warp given physical form, fragments or expressions of the immaterial universe manifested in ways that interact with the material. What they know, in whatever sense that applies to entities of pure psychic energy, includes things about the nature of the warp and the chaos gods, and the relationships between the material and immaterial universes that no human scholar has ever had access to in a form they could survive receiving. Abaddon. At the moment when Valdor's spear connected and the first captain's future was suddenly visible, the despoiler's path across 10,000 years, the shape of what he would do and become and destroy, laid out in whatever format the spear communicates its truths. The accumulated knowledge of all of these beings, added together and filtered through 10 millennia of Valdor's extraordinary mind, is not just a library, it's a perspective, a way of understanding the universe that is genuinely unique, that no one else has, and that no one else could develop by any other means. Because the means requires both the specific weapon and the specific person wielding it across a specific length of time, doing a specific kind of work. If Valdor is the king in yellow, and if the king in yellow is building towards something that requires the deepest possible understanding of both the warp and the mechanisms of chaos, then the Apollonian spear is not just his weapon, it's his research tool. It's the instrument through which he has been gathering, for 10,000 years, the knowledge that his plan requires. This reframes the entire body of Valdor's career in an interesting way. The battles he fought weren't just battles. The enemies he killed weren't just enemies. Every conflict, every campaign, every individual opponent who fell to the Apollonian spear was also a data point in a study of the universe's nature that has now been running longer than most civilizations in the setting have existed. And the conclusions of that study are close to being ready to be applied. Extended section: The Silence and What It Means When the Greatest Guardian Steps Away. One of the questions that nobody in the lore asks directly, but that hangs over the entire story of Valdor's disappearance, is, what did the other custodians think? The 10,000 are not simple beings. They're not servitors, not machines, not the kind of completely obedient warriors who would simply not register the absence of their captain general until someone told them to. Each custodian is, by design, and by the Emperor's deliberate intent, an individual of extraordinary intelligence and judgment. They are capable of independent assessment and independent action. They have opinions, and they have a relationship with their institution's history and founders that, while perhaps different from the way ordinary soldiers relate to their commanders, is nonetheless real. When Valdor left, they noticed, and they searched, and they found nothing. And then, because they are what they are, they continued their vigil. This is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary thing in the entire story. 10,000 warriors of unparalleled capability, any one of whom is individually more formidable than almost anything else in the Imperium, looked at the absence of their founder and said, in the way that the custodians always say things, functionally, completely, without visible distress, right, the work continues. We will be what we were built to be. There is loyalty in this that goes beyond what orders can produce. The custodians kept faith with the institution Valdor created, not because he was present to enforce that faith, but because the institution itself was what it was, and being what they were, they maintained it. They kept his memory alive, not in the way that a cult keeps a founder's memory alive, with ceremony and excess, and the gradual distortion of what was actually said and done into what's useful to the current leadership, but in the way that a very honest institution keeps a founder's memory alive, by doing the thing the founder did, to the standard the founder set, every single day. And possibly this is inference rather than explicit lore, but it feels consistent with the character of the organization at least some of the custodians may have known or guessed, more than the official silence suggested. The custodians are very old, many of them. Their institutional memory of Valdor's character and operating methods is extensive. People who have served alongside someone of that quality for long enough develop an understanding of what they would and wouldn't do, what choices they would and wouldn't make, what kind of mission would have taken them away from their post. A being who spent centuries maintaining a vast intelligence network, who always acted toward the Emperor's genuine purposes rather than toward institutional convention, who was capable of the ruthless pragmatism required by the Officio Assassinorum's first deployment, and simultaneously the human complexity required by the decision to spare Candlewire. A being like that, the older custodians might have concluded, would not leave without reason. And if there was a reason, and if the reason was consistent with everything that being had always stood for, then perhaps the appropriate response was not to mourn the departure, but to maintain the post while the departure did its work. This is speculation, but it feels like the kind of speculation that honors both the institution and the individual, which seems appropriate. What we can say with certainty is that the Adeptus Custodes that we see in the 41st millennium, the force that has begun, under the pressure of the Great Rift and Robert Guillemon's return, to take a more active role in the galaxy's defense, carries within it the legacy of what Valdor built. Every custodian who fights with the particular quality that distinguishes them from Space Marines, the individual judgment, the absolute loyalty to the Emperor's person rather than to any institutional interpretation, the willingness to act decisively and independently when the situation demands. It is expressing something that Valdor established as the standard in the years when he was building the 10,000 from nothing. He is not remembered in the same way that Guilliman is remembered, or Sanguinius, or Horus. He is not a legend in the way that they are legends, with associated mythology and chapter cults and the kind of broader cultural presence that the most dramatic figures of the heresy era maintain in imperial consciousness. He is more like a foundation stone, something that everything else rests on, present in the structure of what was built, but not visible in the way that the architecture above it is visible. The oldest of the custodians know his name. They know what he did. They know that what they are begins with him. And if any of them have an assessment of what the King in Yellow might be, and what the King in Yellow might be working toward, that assessment is locked behind the same wall that separates Custodian inner life from Custodian outer expression. Extended section. The long game 10,000 years as a strategic unit of time. One of the hardest things for any ordinary mind to process about Constantine Valdor is the time scale on which he operates. 10,000 years. Let that sit for a moment as a literal number rather than an abstract historical marker. 10,000 years ago, in the real world, human civilization was at its absolute earliest stage of development. Writing had just been invented. In some places hadn't been invented yet. In other places would not be invented for another 1,000 years. The wheel was new. The first permanent cities were just beginning to exist. The accumulated knowledge of all human history that we currently possess, every scientific discovery, every artistic achievement, every philosophical insight, every technological development from the wheel to the quantum computer, all of that happened within the span of time we're describing. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, that 10,000 years of time has seen the Imperium rise from the immediate aftermath of its worst crisis to its current state of grinding, embattled, mystical imperialism. 10,000 years of war. 10,000 years of the Emperor on the throne. 10,000 years of the Astronomicon maintained by psychic sacrifice. 10,000 years of the Adeptus Mechanicus maintaining technology they don't fully understand. Of the Inquisition hunting threats from within and without. Of the Space Marine chapters, defending worlds that the ordinary human population has never heard of, against enemies that would kill that population without particular notice if the Marines weren't there. Valdor has been working for all of this. In whatever form he currently occupies, as the King in Yellow or something else, in whatever extimate space serves as his base of operations, with whatever network of agents and resources and accumulated knowledge he's assembled across 10,000 years of patient, methodical, invisible effort, he's been at it for all of it. What does 10,000 years of dedicated, intelligent work toward a specific goal produce? The short answer is things that are impossible to understand from the outside, because the period of time required to build them is longer than human experience can fully process. We have intuitions about what 5 years of work looks like, or 20 years, or even a lifetime of 60 or 70 years. We don't have intuitions about 10,000 years, because nothing human scale persists long enough to make that comparison meaningful. But we can try. We can note that the most sophisticated long-term strategic enterprises in human history, the ones that operated over generations rather than years, that built institutions and knowledge bases that outlasted their founders and continued to develop after the original architects were gone, those enterprises achieved things that seemed impossible from the perspective of any single lifetime spent within them. The long-term development of democratic governance, the multi-century projects of cathedral construction, the slow accumulation of scientific knowledge across the development of academic institutions. These things, which look inevitable in retrospect, were each the product of work extending far beyond any individual actor. Now scale that up. 10,000 years of a single, continuous, extraordinarily intelligent consciousness working toward one goal. 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the warp, about chaos, about the nature of reality, about what the Emperor actually wanted and why, about what tools exist and what tools need to be built, and how to build them without being noticed by either the Imperium's institutions or the Chaos Gods, that the plan is ultimately aimed at undermining. Whatever Valdor has built across those 10 millennia, it is genuinely incomprehensible from the inside of a single human lifetime. The Inquisitors who've been tracking the King in Yellow have been doing so for at most a few decades of a single human lifetime. What they can perceive is the surface of the thing, the edges where it interacts with the existing world in ways that leave traces. The center of it, the structure, the purpose, the full scope of what's been assembled is something they can't see from where they stand. This is, in the deepest sense, what it means to be Constantine Valdor. To be capable of operating on timescales that no one else in the setting can fully comprehend, pursuing a goal whose logic is invisible to most observers, because the context that makes it logical, the Emperor's actual intentions as Valdor understood them, has been lost to everyone else for 10,000 years. He carries that context alone, and he acts from it alone. And whatever he's been building, it is the product of the only mind in the galaxy that has both the capability and the information required to build it. When the countdown reaches zero, if it reaches zero, if the King in Yellow theory is correct, and Valdor's plan is approaching completion, what will emerge from 10,000 years of that work is something that the 41st millennium, in all its darkness and complexity, may not have a category for. Something that was at the beginning, and may still be at the end. Something built from gold, and patience, and truth. The first of the 10,000. Still counting. Extended section. The conversation he never had Valdor, and the Primarchs. One of the most significant underexplored aspects of Valdor's story is his relationship to the Primarchs, the 20 sons of the Emperor, who were, in the formal hierarchy of the 31st millennium, among the most powerful individuals in the Imperium. The hierarchy question is interesting, because technically Valdor occupied a rank that the lore describes as higher than a Primarch. He was the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal champion, the being who served as the Emperor's most direct representative in situations where the Emperor himself could not be present. A Primarch commanded a legion of Space Marines. Valdor commanded the guardians of the Emperor's person. In terms of proximity to ultimate power, and in terms of the trust invested in his position, Valdor outranked the Primarchs in a way that the Primarchs themselves seem to have understood, even if some of them found it uncomfortable. He never swaggered. He never leveraged the rank to diminish or challenge the Primarchs in their own domains. When Rogel Dorn and Valdor argued during the heresy, and they argued substantively about the assassination mission against Horus, about how to fight the war, about what the Imperium was, for those arguments were conducted between equals. Dorn didn't defer. Valdor didn't condescend. They disagreed the way two people who are both right about different parts of the same situation always disagree. With genuine force, with the full weight of their respective convictions, and ultimately with the capacity to accept the Emperor's arbitration without either of them having to abandon their position. With other Primarchs, the relationship was different in character, if not in fundamental quality. Sanguinius, the Great Angel, was the Primarch whose death during the Siege of Terra hit Valdor with visible force. The lore is specific about this. Of all the losses of the heresy, and there were staggering losses, losses that reshaped the Imperium, losses that cannot be understated in their consequence. Sanguinius's death was the one that the first Custodian carried in a way that was visible to others. Something about the angel had reached through Valdor's composure and found something underneath that was capable of genuine attachment, genuine grief. It might have been the quality of absolute self-sacrifice. Sanguinius knew, through his gift of foresight, that he was going to die. He had seen it coming for years, and he went anyway. Not because he believed he could change the outcome of his own death, but he knew he couldn't, but because his presence mattered to the people around him, because the Blood Angels who followed him needed to see their father in the field, because there were things that needed to be done on the vengeful spirit that his presence made possible, even if the final moment of his story was already written. This is a quality that Valdor would have recognized, the willingness to serve a purpose, even when the cost is personally devastating, even when the outcome for you specifically is already settled. The commitment to doing what needs to be done for its own sake, rather than for what you'll get out of it. Leman Russ was a more complex case. Valdor was critical of the Space Wolves' rune priests in a way that Russ almost certainly heard. He considered their practices to be in violation of the Nicaea Edict, regardless of how the Space Wolves framed them culturally. He returned Russ's spear when the Wolf King left Terra, and he didn't send him off with blessings. But there was something like respect in the interaction. Even so, the recognition of a being who, whatever his specific disagreements with imperial policy, was genuinely committed to the same broad goal. Russ also disappeared, in the approximate period around Valdor's disappearance, walking into the Eye of Terror with a handful of warriors and a stated intention to return when the Imperium had need of him again. Whether these two disappearances are connected, whether Russ knew something about what Valdor was planning, or whether there was some arrangement between them, the lore hasn't said. But the timing is interesting, and in a setting where timing is rarely accidental, it's worth holding as a question. The one Primarch interaction that has the most specific and documented lore to work with is Valdor's duel, if it can be called a duel, with Alfarius. Alfarius, the most secretive and the most tactically cunning of the Primarchs, once crossed paths with Valdor in a way that the first Custodian apparently didn't realize was a test until it was already over. He fought this mysterious warrior to a standstill and didn't recognize him as a Primarch until afterward. The lore notes with characteristic dryness that Valdor was rather annoyed when he understood what had happened. Alfarius's assessment, from his own perspective, was that he could have killed Valdor if he'd chosen to, that the decision to fight to a draw rather than to a conclusion was his, made for reasons that suited the Alpha Legion's perpetual, inscrutable agenda. Whether this is true is a genuinely interesting question. Valdor is described in multiple sources as capable of fighting most Primarchs and potentially winning. Alfarius was not one of the physically strongest of the Emperor's sons. His particular gift was deception and tactical misdirection rather than raw combat power. The claim that he could have killed the first Custodian in a straight fight is, at minimum, questionable. But the incident reveals something about the gap between the two figures. Alfarius was playing a game whose scope was larger than any single engagement. Valdor was fighting, as he always fought, completely. One of them left that encounter having learned something more than they knew before. The other didn't know exactly what he'd faced until the moment had passed. This kind of interaction, where Valdor's absolute commitment to the immediate moment is tested against a longer game thinker, is interesting in retrospect. Because, by the 41st millennium, if the King in Yellow theory is correct, Valdor himself has become the longest game thinker in the setting. He has had 10,000 years to develop the kind of strategic patience that Alfarius employed across a lifetime. He has had 10,000 years to think about what he's doing and why, to refine the plan, to account for complications, and adjust to developments that no advanced planning could have anticipated. The first Custodian and the Hydra Primarch were both, in their different ways, beings who understood that the most important battles aren't always the ones that look like battles from the outside. Alfarius taught Valdor that lesson, perhaps by example. And Valdor, in 10,000 years of work that looks to the outside world like heresy, may be proving that he learned it well. Extended section. The Emperor's final instruction. What was said before the throne? There is one more thing that deserves attention before we close this story, because it shapes the way everything else fits together. The question of what the Emperor told Valdor before he was incapacitated. The lore doesn't give us a specific final conversation. It doesn't show us the scene in the Golden Throne Room where the Emperor was installed on the device that would preserve him and simultaneously imprison him, in which he might have spoken to his most faithful guardian before the psychic demands of sustaining himself on the throne made direct communication impossible. We don't know what was said in that room, or whether words were exchanged at all, or whether whatever communication happened was of a kind that didn't use words. But consider what we know about the Emperor's characteristic approach to information. He didn't tell people things they didn't need to know. He was not transparent in the way that Valdor was not transparent. He held things in reserve. He revealed on a timeline that served purposes that the recipients of the information couldn't always perceive. And he had been planning for contingencies since before the Unification Wars. He had been building systems and safety nets and secondary plans for every major element of his project for as long as he'd been working on the project itself. The contingency plan for what happened if the heresy couldn't be fully stopped at the Siege of Terra, if the Emperor was wounded beyond recovery, if the Golden Throne became a necessity rather than a choice, if the Primarchs were lost and the legions were shattered and the Webway project was abandoned, and everything that had been the active, vital, achieving form of the Emperor's dream had to be replaced by a defensive crouch that might last millennia before an opportunity for something better emerged. That contingency plan existed. It had to have existed. The Emperor was not the kind of mind that failed to plan for the worst case, and the most likely person to be told about that plan, in whatever form it took, was the being who stood closest to the Emperor through the entire period leading up to the catastrophe. The first Custodian. The person who had been present for the decisions about what the Imperium was supposed to be and why. The person whose loyalty was the most absolute and whose capability for long-term, independent action was the greatest. If there was a plan for what came after, Valdor was the one who received it. And if Valdor received it, he carried it out of the palace that night, whispered those two words to the dark, and began the 10,000-year process of making it real. This is, finally, what makes the King in Yellow theory not just compelling, but necessary to the internal logic of the setting. The Emperor was not careless. The Emperor did not leave the future of his project to chance. He built systems, he built redundancies, he built the people who would serve those systems with the kind of loyalty that could endure even his incapacitation. The Golden Throne was never meant to be permanent. The Astronomicon was never meant to be the long-term answer to human navigation of the warp. The current state of the Imperium grinding, embattled, mystical, desperately preserving capabilities it doesn't fully understand, in service of purposes that have become ritualized beyond recognition, is not the Emperor's intended end state. It's what the heresy forced on his project in the place of what he'd been building toward. Somewhere out there, in the dark that the Emperor's light still pushes against, someone is working to get the project back on track. Someone who knows what on track actually means because he was told. Someone who has had 10,000 years to gather what's needed and build what needs to be built and wait for the moment when it can be used. He walks in yellow through the shadows of the 41st millennium. He holds a spear that tells him the truth about everything it touches. He is old beyond the comprehension of the beings who are hunting him, and his vigil is not yet ended. Only in death does duty end. He is still alive. Extended section: the Valdor, Tank Hunter, and other legacies in stone and steel. There is a particular kind of honor that institutions bestow on their greatest servants, and it is often the most honest kind. They name things after them. Not ceremonies or holidays, but tools. Working things. Devices that are deployed and used in the pursuit of the same purposes the honored person spent their life serving. The naming is not decorative, it's functional. It says, "This thing we use now, in the work we still do, carries the name of the one who taught us how to do this work at its highest level." The Valdor Tank Hunter carries the first Custodian's name, and the name is earned. In the arsenal of the Legio Custodes during the Horus Heresy era, the Valdor Tank Hunter is one of the most powerful armored vehicles in Imperial service, a predatory, low-profile machine built around an extraordinarily lethal anti-vehicle cannon called the Lightning Lock, supplemented by an advanced targeter, and the kind of secondary weapon systems that reflect the Custodian philosophy applied to armored warfare. It is not a mass-produced vehicle. It is, in the tradition of everything the Custodians use, something that exists at the upper limit of what the technology of its era can produce. There are not many of them. Each one that exists represents an enormous investment of resources and expertise. The vehicle is named for a man who, at the time of the heresy, was still alive and present, and presumably would have had opinions about having his name attached to a tank. It's one of those moments where the lore quietly reminds you that the people we're talking about were not abstractions. They were present. They were known to their contemporaries. The honor of having a major weapons platform named after you, during the period when your active career was still ongoing, speaks to how people who had served alongside Valdor thought about him as someone whose standard was so clearly the standard for their entire enterprise, that there was no more natural tribute than to extend that standard into the Fald, domain of armored warfare. The Lightning Lock deserves special mention in any discussion of things named for Valdor, because the connection between the weapon's name and the quality of the man it honors is not accidental. Lightning in the Warhammer context is associated with speed and inevitability, the thing that arrives between one moment and the next, that cannot be dodged because it's already there. This is precisely what people who saw Valdor fight consistently struggled to articulate, the sense that he was already where he needed to be before the situation had fully declared where that was. The Valdor Tank Hunter's lore also reflects, in the way that vehicles do in the Warhammer universe, the broader philosophy of its patron institution. It's built for specific targets. It's not a general-purpose vehicle that does many things adequately. It is a weapon designed to do one thing: destroy specific categories of enemy armor and fortification at an extreme level of capability. This specificity is not a limitation. It's a philosophical statement about the value of purpose over versatility, of doing the thing you're built for at the highest possible level, over doing many things at a merely adequate one. Valdor never tried to be everything. He tried to be the best possible version of the specific thing the Emperor built him to be. The tank hunter that carries his name follows the same principle. And in doing so, it is, in its way, a portrait. Beyond the vehicle, Valdor's legacy in the 41st millennium takes subtler forms. The Adeptus Custodes, as an institution, carries his imprint in ways that are visible in their doctrine, their culture, and their characteristic approach to problems. The emphasis on individual excellence over collective mass. The insistence on understanding the Emperor's actual will, rather than its institutional interpretation. The willingness to act independently and decisively, rather than waiting for authorization in situations where authorization would arrive too late to matter. The habit of treating each custodian as a singular individual whose judgment matters, rather than as an interchangeable component in a larger system. These are all Valdor's principles, encoded into the institution he built and maintained for centuries before his disappearance. The custodians who walk the halls of the Imperial Palace in the 41st millennium have likely never met him. The oldest of them would have been alive when he left, though whether they have personal memories of him is less certain. But they practice what he established as the standard, because the standard is built into the institution itself. This is, perhaps, his most durable legacy. Not the dramatic moments of the heresy, not the specific battles or the specific decisions, but the institution that has kept functioning for 10,000 years after he left it. The 10,000, maintaining their vigil, doing their duty, being what he made them. If the Imperium still stands in the 41st millennium, and it does, however embattled, and however diminished from the Emperor's original vision, it stands partly because the guards on the most important gate in human history were built to a standard that has not required compromise across 10 millennia. That's not a small thing. That's not a modest legacy. In a universe where most institutions degrade over centuries into shadows of their original purpose, having built something that held its essential quality for 10,000 years is genuinely extraordinary. He was the first of the 10,000, and the 10,000 are still standing. Extended section. What we don't know, the gaps that make the mystery. One of the most important things to acknowledge when you're doing a deep dive on a character like Valdor is how much we don't know. The lore is not complete. The Black Library fiction is ongoing. Dan Abnett, who is writing both the Bequin trilogy conclusion and was deeply involved in the Siege of Terra series, is the person most likely to determine what Valdor's fate actually means, and that determination hasn't been fully made public yet. What we don't know includes whether the King in Yellow is definitively Constantine Valdor, or whether the name in the decoded book is a misdirection or a reference that works differently than it appears to. We don't know the specific nature of whatever the King in Yellow is building toward, beyond the clues the fiction has provided. We don't know whether the countdown in the book implies a confrontation with the forces hunting the king, or a moment when whatever he's built becomes ready to be used, or some third option that the available information hasn't suggested. We don't know whether Valdor has maintained his original identity across 10,000 years, or whether some aspect of who he is has changed in ways we'd find unexpected. We don't know whether the Apollonian spear is still with him, or whether it has passed on or been modified or lost in circumstances the lore hasn't addressed. What we also don't know, and this is perhaps the most significant unknown of all, is what the Emperor has been doing on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. Not in the mechanical sense. The lore is reasonably clear that he maintains the Astronomicon and pushes back chaos through sheer psychic force. But in the sense of whether there is still a conscious will behind those activities, whether there is still genuine agency and awareness behind the face of the Emperor, as it has been described in 40,000-era fiction, whether the Emperor and Valdor, in whatever form their relationship currently takes across the veil of the Golden Throne, are in any sense still working toward the same thing. These unknowns are, in a strange way, part of the appeal. Valdor is compelling because he's unfinished, because the story of the first custodian is not closed, because whatever he's been doing for 10,000 years may have been building to something that will matter to the ongoing narrative of the setting in ways that nothing else currently on the board can quite match. The Inquisitors who've been hunting the King in Yellow have been treating him as a threat. The Eldar who've been monitoring his activities have been responding with something between alarm and something harder to name. The Chaos Forces, who presumably know, on some level, that there is someone out there who understands them better than any material being, should they haven't been acting complacent. None of this is the behavior of factions responding to something small or controllable. Whatever is coming, it is going to matter. And the name at the center of it is the same name that stood at the Emperor's shoulder before any of this started. Constantine Valdor, the first of the 10,000. Still working. If you've made it here, I am deeply, genuinely grateful for your time and your attention. This is one of those characters who deserves more discussion than he usually gets, who sits in the background of the big, dramatic heresy narratives, and quietly holds together everything that makes those narratives mean something. The first Custodian is not the most famous name in Warhammer 40,000. He is not the most immediately dramatic figure. He is something rarer than famous or dramatic. He is faithful, across the longest timescale in the setting, to the thing that matters most. If this gave you something new to think about, or if it reminded you why you found this universe worth your attention in the first place, then it did its job. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's in the audience. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is a good time for that. There's a great deal more ahead, and I'd very much like you to be there for it. The vigil continues, and so do we.